I said, no, Elvis, I'm not going to do it. What do you mean you're not going to do it? I said, no, I don't think you're in the right mood for that, and it wouldn't be right for you. So we got a big fight.
Everyone thinks they know how Elvis Presley passed away, but United States Marshal, who was actually there that night, has spent 50 years carrying a version of events nothing like the one the public was given. What did he witness that had to be buried? And who made sure the world never found out? Join us as we finally hear the account hidden for half a century. The night everyone thinks they know. August 16th, 1977 is a date that stopped the world.
Elvis Presley died today. He was 42. Apparently it was a heart attack. He was found at his home in Memphis, not breathing. His road manager tried to revive him.
A date burned into the memory of millions of people who were alive to hear the news. And even those who weren't, a date that has been repeated so many times, it feels like a story everyone already knows the ending to. Elvis Presley, the most famous entertainer who ever lived, was found unresponsive at his Graceland mansion in Memphis, Tennessee, by his fiancée, Ginger Alden, in the early afternoon hours. And by evening, the news had spread to every corner of the planet, triggering a wave of grief that felt more like the loss of a world leader than a musician. The official story was straightforward, and the media delivered it quickly. A man worn down by years of health struggles, prescription medication, and the weight of a life lived entirely in public. A sad but unsurprising end to a complicated chapter in American history. A closed case before most people even had time to ask questions. But here's the thing about closed cases. They are only closed because someone decided to close them, because decades later, a man who was actually inside that world on that night has come forward with a version of events that does not match the one the public was given. And the details he carries are not the kind that fade with time. They are the kind that keep a person awake for 50 years. And if the official story was incomplete all along, then what other details from that night were quietly buried alongside the king himself? A man who stayed silent for decades. Not every witness to history announces themselves, and some of the most important ones never do, carrying what they saw in silence for years, sometimes decades, sometimes all the way to the grave. Because the things they witnessed were not the kind you talked about openly, not if you valued your career, your reputation, or your peace of mind. This man was not a fan chasing an autograph outside the Graceland gates, and he was not a journalist, piecing together a story from secondhand sources. He was a federal officer, a United States Marshal, a man trained to observe, to document, and to operate within systems that demanded discretion above almost everything else. He had been around long enough to understand how power worked, how narratives got shaped, and how quickly a person could find themselves on the wrong side of an institution if they started asking the wrong questions out loud. And so, for a very long time, he simply did not. He went home. He filed what he was permitted to file. He moved on to the next assignment, and the next, and the one after that. And the years stacked up the way they do, and the world kept spinning, and Elvis Presley remained frozen in amber as an icon, a legend, a tragedy. While this man kept his version of that night locked somewhere, very few people are disciplined enough to keep things. But time has a way of loosening what silence once held tight. And the people who surrounded those events, the ones who might have had reasons to keep certain things quiet, are mostly gone now. And the weight of carrying an untold story across an entire lifetime is not a small thing. He is not coming forward for money, and he is not coming forward for attention. He is coming forward because what he saw that night at Graceland does not match what the world was told. And somewhere along the way, the distance between those two things became impossible to keep living with. He was there, he was watching, he was trained to notice exactly the kinds of details that other people missed. And what he noticed that night was deeply fundamentally wrong. And the question that has followed him ever since is a simple one. If he saw what he saw, then who decided the public didn't need to know? Why was a U.S. Marshal there? Elvis Presley was a celebrity, an entertainer, a man who sold out arenas and moved millions of records. And on the surface, nothing about that profile requires the presence of a federal law enforcement officer, the kind of officer whose jurisdiction involves fugitives, court orders, and matters of national significance, not rock and roll. But Elvis Presley was not simply a celebrity, and the longer you look at his life during the 1970s, the more complicated that picture becomes, because by that point in his life, Elvis had cultivated relationships that stretched well beyond the world of entertainment and into places that most people in his position never got close to.
Right by your side. I need your sweet helping hand. My love's too strong to...
His relationship with law enforcement was unusually deep and unusually personal. He sought it out. He celebrated it. He collected badges from agencies across the country, and his famous visit to President Nixon in 1970 was not just a strange pop culture footnote. It was a moment in which Elvis reportedly offered himself as a federal agent at large, willing to work in ways that a man of his particular access and influence uniquely could. Whether those offers translated into anything formal, anything active, anything that would have made him a genuine asset to federal agencies during a period of serious domestic tension, is something that has never been fully confirmed or fully denied. And that ambiguity is precisely what makes the presence of a United States Marshal on the grounds of Graceland that night so difficult to simply set aside. Protection and surveillance are not always easy to tell apart from the outside, and sometimes the person at the center of either one is not entirely sure which category they fall into themselves. So, was Elvis being protected that night, or was he being watched? And does the answer to that question change everything about what happened after the panic broke out inside those walls? Because the marshal who was there believes the answer matters more than anyone in charge ever wanted to admit. The atmosphere that night. There is a version of August 16th, 1977 that gets told in soft tones. A quiet afternoon at Graceland, a man who had been struggling with his health for years. A peaceful if heartbreaking end to a life that had burned very bright and very hard. And that version has a kind of sad dignity to it that people found easier to accept than the alternative. But the marshal who was present at Graceland that day describes an atmosphere that sounds nothing like that. And the word he returns to more than once when talking about how that afternoon felt before anything was officially wrong is tense.
Told him not to fall asleep in the bathroom, and he said, I won't. And he turned, gave me a little wave, walked into the bathroom, and I found him a little while later. It was a devastating day.
Not the ordinary tension of a busy household managing a complicated man's complicated life, but something heavier than that. Something with an edge to it that he noticed the moment he arrived and that did not ease as the hours passed. The kind of tension that experienced officers learn to read the way other people read weather. A feeling in the air that something is already in motion even before anyone has said a word. Access inside the property felt different that day, more restricted than it should have been given what was supposedly just a normal afternoon at the residence, with certain areas of the house effectively sealed off in ways that struck him as unusual, not chaotic, but deliberate. The kind of deliberate that requires someone with authority to make it happen. Staff members who would ordinarily move freely through the property were behaving in ways that felt constrained and watchful, not grieving, not alarmed in any visible way, but careful. The way people are careful when they are aware that something around them requires a level of caution they have not been fully briefed on. He had been in enough charge environments over the course of his career to know the difference between a household managing ordinary stress and a household managing something it had been told not to discuss. And what he was standing inside that afternoon felt unmistakably like the second thing. All of this was before any alarm was raised, before any call went out, before the world received the news that would stop it in its tracks, which means the atmosphere he was reading was not a reaction to what happened. It was already there, waiting, and that is perhaps the most unsettling detail of everything that followed. The moment everything changed. There is a specific kind of moment that law enforcement officers describe when recounting the point at which a situation crosses from uneasy into undeniable. Not a gradual shift, but a sudden one. A line that gets crossed and cannot be uncrossed. And the marshal remembers the exact moment that line appeared at Graceland with the kind of clarity that only comes from experiences that rewire something permanent inside a person. It was not the quiet, sorrowful discovery that the public record describes, not a gentle stumbling upon a man at rest, not a soft and private moment of realization followed by a measured response. What he witnessed was urgency, the kind that moves through a space like a current, pulling everyone in its path into motion before they have fully processed what they are moving toward. There was confusion, not the organic confusion of people overwhelmed by sudden grief, but a more structured kind of confusion, the kind that happens when different people in the same space are operating from different sets of information. When some people know more than others, and the ones who know more are trying to manage the ones who don't, and the whole thing has the texture of a situation being handled rather than a situation being discovered. There were conflicting instructions moving through the property in those first minutes. Voices carrying authority that did not belong to the people who would ordinarily have been in charge of anything at Graceland, directions being given and adjusted and redirected in ways that struck him immediately as wrong for what this was supposed to be: a medical emergency in a private home. In a genuine emergency of that kind, the instinct is always toward action, toward getting help inside as fast as possible, toward removing obstacles rather than creating them. But what he observed in those first critical minutes felt less like people trying to solve a problem and more like people trying to control the shape of it, to manage what was seen and by whom and in what order. He stood inside that and watched it, trained eyes taking in details that his mind was already filing and flagging, because that is what his training demanded, and what those details told him in the aggregate was something that would take years to fully sit with. Someone in that building, in those first moments, was already thinking about the story, not just about the man. The details that never made the news. Every major event has two versions, the one that gets reported and the one that gets lived, and in most cases, those two versions are close enough that the distance between them doesn't matter very much, but occasionally, the gap between what happened and what was told is wide enough to ask serious questions about who was doing the telling and what they chose to leave out. The Marshal began noticing specific details in those early minutes that never appeared in any account he later read. Not in the press coverage, not in the official documentation, not in the years of books and documentaries that followed. Details that were not dramatic on their own, but that formed a pattern when you held them together, the kind of pattern that a trained observer cannot simply decide to unsee. The timeline of the emergency calls did not match what he witnessed on the ground. There were delays that had no obvious medical or logistical explanation, gaps between when certain people became aware of the situation and when the appropriate calls were made, and in an emergency involving a person of Elvis Presley's profile and the resources available at Graceland, those gaps were not small, and they were not nothing. People were moving through areas of the property that should have been locked down the moment a medical crisis was confirmed, entering and leaving rooms in a sequence that made no sense if the only priority was getting help to someone who needed it. And some of those movements felt purposeful in a way that casual panic does not produce. Deliberate rather than reactive, organized rather than frantic. There were conversations happening in corners and hallways that stopped when he came near, brief and quiet exchanges between people who did not look frightened so much as focused. The look of people coordinating rather than grieving, and none of those conversations appeared anywhere in the documentation that followed. He noted all of it, mentally and otherwise, because that was what he was there to do, and because something in his training kept insisting that what he was standing inside was not simply the tragic end of a troubled man's life. It was a scene that was being managed from the inside, in real time, by people who had clearly thought about this moment before it arrived. And that realization did not leave him when he walked out of Graceland that evening. It followed him home, and it never fully left. The orders. He didn't question. Then there is a discipline that comes with federal service that civilian life rarely produces. A conditioning toward following the chain of command without hesitation, without visible resistance, without allowing personal discomfort to interrupt the execution of an instruction given by someone with the authority to give it. And for most of a career, that conditioning serves a person well. It keeps operations clean and outcomes predictable, and institutions functioning the way institutions are supposed to function. On the night of August 16th, 1977, that conditioning is what kept the Marshal in line, and it is also what he has spent decades quietly reckoning with. He was instructed at key moments to stay back, not in a way that was explained or justified, but in the flat, expectation-laden way that orders get delivered when the person giving them does not feel they owe anyone a reason, and he stayed back because that is what you do when you are operating inside a structure that has decided certain things are above your clearance level. Certain areas of the property became inaccessible to him during the most critical window of time, not chaotically, not because of the natural press of a crisis unfolding, but in a manner that felt prearranged, as though the boundaries had been drawn before the situation officially began, and the people enforcing those boundaries were not the kind of people who took questions well. He did not ask questions, not then, because the training said you don't, and because in the moment, there is always a version of events you can tell yourself that makes the instructions seem reasonable, that makes staying back feel like professionalism rather than complicity. That makes following orders feel like duty rather than something you will one day have to answer for in your own conscience. It was only later, in the hours and days and eventually years that followed, that he began to examine those instructions with the detachment that distance allows, and what he found when he looked at them clearly was that they made no sense within any legitimate operational framework he had ever been trained to understand. The orders he received that night were not designed to protect an investigation. They were not designed to preserve a scene. They were designed to limit what certain people saw. And when he eventually asked himself who benefited from that limitation, the answer pointed somewhere he had not expected and did not want to follow. But follow it he did eventually, because some questions do not allow you to simply put them down. The official story versus what he saw. The official account of Elvis Presley's death is a matter of public record, documented in coroner's reports and press releases and court filings, and the collective memory of a media cycle that moved fast and closed faster. A neat and contained narrative delivered to a grieving public who had enough sadness on their hands without being asked to question the details of how it arrived. The Marshal read that account, and then he read it again. And what he found the second time was the same thing he found the first, a version of events that did not align with his memory in ways that were too specific and too numerous to explain as simple error or the ordinary compression that official documentation sometimes applies to complicated situations. The timing was wrong, not slightly wrong in the way that eyewitness accounts often diverge from records, but wrong in ways that pointed to something deliberate. Key moments in the sequence of that afternoon placed in an order that did not match what he had witnessed, a timeline that created a cleaner story, but not an accurate one. The people present in certain areas of the property during the most critical window were not the people the official record placed there, and the actions attributed to specific individuals in the documentation did not match his recollection of where those individuals were and what they were doing during the same period. Discrepancies that a person could dismiss one at a time, but that accumulated into something harder to wave away. He had written his own account in the hours following, the kind of notes an officer makes when the training insists on documentation. And when he held those notes against the official version he was later given, the distance between them was not a matter of perspective or interpretation. It was a matter of fact, and the facts did not agree. He did not go to anyone with this immediately, partly because the system he worked within did not reward that kind of friction, and partly because some part of him was still trying to find an explanation that didn't require him to conclude what the evidence kept pointing toward, that the story the world received about what happened inside Graceland on August 16, 1977, was not the story of what actually happened inside those walls. And somewhere, someone knew exactly how wide that gap was and decided the public would never need to close it. The silence that followed. The days after August 16th moved quickly, the way days tend to move when the world is processing something enormous. And inside the machinery of the institutions involved, there was a momentum toward closure that felt less like grief and more like pressure. A collective leaning toward the next thing that discouraged anyone from standing still long enough to ask whether the last thing had been properly understood. The Marshal filed what he was permitted to file, because that is what the process required, and he did it carefully and honestly, noting what he had observed in the language that federal documentation demands, precise and measured and stripped of the kind of personal interpretation that official reports are not designed to carry. And then he waited for the follow-up that the nature of what he had recorded seemed to make inevitable. It never came. No one called him back in to clarify his account. No one cross-referenced his notes against the official timeline. No one sat across a table from him and walked through the discrepancies that anyone reading his report alongside the public record would have immediately identified. There was simply nothing, a silence so complete and so prompt that it communicated something all by itself. He was not naive enough to think that silence was accidental. A person does not spend years operating inside federal systems without developing an understanding of how institutions communicate through what they choose not to do. And what the absence of any follow-up told him was that his report had been received, assessed, and filed somewhere it would not cause friction. There was pressure in those weeks, not overt and not threatening, but present in the way that certain kinds of institutional pressure always are. A general atmosphere that made clear, without ever saying so directly, that the appropriate response to what had happened was to move forward, to step into the next assignment and carry the last one quietly and without making it a conversation. He understood the message because he had been trained in the same system that was sending it. And for a long time, he did what it asked, because the personal cost of doing otherwise felt very large, and the likelihood of anything changing felt very small. Decades of silence followed, and the world kept telling itself the version it had been given. And the Marshal kept living alongside the version he knew. Why he's speaking now. There is a particular kind of accounting that happens later in life when the structures that once made silence feel reasonable have either crumbled or lost their hold. And the people whose interests were protected by that silence are no longer in a position to enforce it, and what remains is just a person, and the weight of what they chose not to say for a very long time, and the question of whether that weight deserves to finally be set down. The Marshal is older now, and the landscape around that night has changed in ways that matter to him. The key figures who surrounded those events, the ones with the authority and the motivation to keep certain things contained, are mostly gone. And the institutional pressure that once felt immovable has softened with the passage of time into something he can look at from the outside rather than feel from the inside. He is not carrying anger, or at least he does not describe it that way. What he describes is something closer to a persistent discomfort, the kind that settles into a person who has spent a very long time knowing that the account the world operates on is missing something significant. Watching books get written and documentaries get made and theories get debated, all of them circling something without ever landing on it, because the person who could have pointed them in the right direction stayed quiet. He says the truth was not destroyed, it was buried, and he draws a careful distinction between those two things, because something destroyed is gone and cannot be recovered, but something buried is still there, still intact, still waiting for someone to decide that the effort of recovering it is worth making. What pushed him to finally speak is not one single thing, but an accumulation. The passage of time, the departure of the people who built the silence, the personal burden of a story carried too long without anywhere to put it. And perhaps most of all, a conviction that the historical record deserves something closer to the truth than what it currently holds. He is not claiming to have every answer, and he is careful to say so, but he has pieces that the official version does not. And after 50 years of sitting with them alone, he has decided that is no longer acceptable. If you're the theories, this changes. For as long as there has been an official account of Elvis Presley's death, there has been another conversation running alongside it, quieter in some periods and louder in others, carried by people who found the edges of the public narrative too clean, too convenient, too quickly sealed to feel entirely honest. And that conversation has produced theories that range from the plausible to the extraordinary, each one orbiting the same central unease. What the Marshal's account does, if taken seriously, is not resolve those theories, but restructure them, moving certain questions out of the category of speculation and into the category of things that a credible first-hand witness is now placing on the table. And that is a different kind of conversation entirely. The question of whether Elvis was truly alone in the circumstances that led to his death takes on a different weight when a federal officer describes a property that was not behaving like a household in the grip of a private tragedy, but rather like a location where something was being managed, where access was controlled and movements were deliberate, and the people in charge were not the people whose names appear in the official record. The question of whether outside parties had any involvement in the events of that afternoon becomes harder to dismiss when the same officer describes orders he could not trace to any legitimate operational chain. Instructions that restricted his access and shaped what he was able to observe during the most critical window of time, and that originated from somewhere above his level without explanation. The question of whether authorities shaped and controlled the narrative from the very beginning is no longer purely theoretical. When a man who was inside that narrative as it was being constructed describes a gap between what he witnessed and what was subsequently released to the public that is too wide and too specific to be accidental. The version of events the world received was the version someone decided the world should have. Then the most important question is not what was hidden, but who decided to hide it, and whether anything they buried is still recoverable. The truth or just another layer. The Marshal's account cannot be fully verified, and he knows that, and he says so, because the documents that might have corroborated his version are either sealed or missing, or filed somewhere so deep inside an institutional archive that recovering them would require a level of official cooperation that has never been forthcoming on anything connected to that night. What remains is his word, the word of a trained federal observer who was present, who was watching, and who has carried a specific and detailed account for nearly 50 years, without it changing in the ways that fabricated stories tend to change over time. Whether that is enough is a question every person has to answer for themselves. But the detail and the consistency of what he describes is not easy to dismiss, and the pattern it points to is not a comfortable one. He ends with something simple. He does not claim to have the full truth, only a piece of it. And he suspects there are other pieces still out there, held by other people who made the same calculation he once did and chose silence. If this much was hidden, the question that remains is quiet but unshakable. What else?